The morning sun gleamed off the steel towers of Midtown, turning the sidewalks into reflective rivers of light. The city was alive, but Alan Mercer didn't care. To him, mornings were an inconvenient ritual, full of bodies packed into sidewalks, food trucks clogging the curb, and the constant buzz of people who didn't matter. Alan considered himself a man of precision. He always wore a tailored suit, usually navy or gray, with a white shirt crisp enough to cut glass. His shoes were hand-polished every Sunday night. And he walked to the office every morning, rain or shine, because it gave him time to feel superior, to look at the world and rank it in silent judgment. That day, he was in a foul mood. His Uber had cancelled. The dry cleaner had wrinkled his collar. And worse, his assistant had texted that his boss, Jonathan Raleigh, was returning from a trip early and calling an all-hands meeting. Alan, who usually slinked in fashionably late, was now walking briskly for once, but not without his usual scorn for everyone around him. As he reached the corner of 47th and Park, he noticed her. A black woman, standing at the intersection with a calm air about her. She wasn't fidgeting with her phone or anxiously watching the crosswalk light like everyone else. She simply stood tall, serene, holding a leather tote on one arm, wearing a dark maroon trench coat and ankle boots that looked custom-made. Alan instinctively bristled. Something about her presence irritated him. She looked too confident, too composed. He stopped beside her and muttered under his breath, standing there like she owns the damn city. She turned slowly, looking him dead in the eye, her face unreadable. "Excuse me." Alan gave a fake smile, barely turning toward her. "Nothing. Just don't see many people like you around here." There was a pause. The light turned green. "I live here," she said, evenly, and began walking forward. Alan rolled his eyes, shaking his head. "Figures," he muttered, more loudly now. "Always acting like you're something special." But she was already gone, her boots tapping gracefully against the sidewalk, vanishing into the crowd without a single backward glance. No anger. No confrontation. Just gone. Alan didn't know why, but it made him angrier. He stood for a second too long at the corner, still stewing. When he finally started walking again, something gnawed at him, not guilt, but the annoyance of being dismissed. He didn't know yet that this morning would carve shame into his soul for years. Alan stepped into the 31st floor lobby of Lanex Capital, still irritated. His assistant, Karen, met him halfway with a tablet in hand. "Mr. Mercer," she said quickly, "Mr. Raleigh just landed and is heading up for the meeting. You're in conference room B. You'll be presenting the Hunter account overview, right?" Yeah, Alan waved her off. "It's ready. Where's coffee?" "In the conference room," she said. "Also, please be, polite today." Alan narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Karen opened her mouth, thought better of it, and smiled nervously. "Just, company image. New guests are visiting this week. Big partnerships. You know how Mr. Raleigh gets." Alan grunted. Inside the conference room, several department heads were already seated. The massive glass windows offered a sweeping view of the skyline. Alan glanced at the boardroom monitor, where a welcome slide for Raleigh Capital Partners, Strategic Vision 2025, played on loop. He took his usual spot at the far end, near the screen, and poured himself a cup of coffee, black. Within minutes, the door opened, and Jonathan Raleigh walked in. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, tailored suits that always fit too well, and a firm but quiet presence. Behind him walked a woman, poised, elegant, and unmistakable. It was her. The woman from the corner. Alan froze. She wasn't in a maroon trench coat now. She wore a midnight blue dress, diamond studs, and a platinum wedding ring that sparkled under the fluorescent lights. She walked beside Raleigh with practiced familiarity, not like a colleague, not like a client. She was his wife. Jonathan gestured to her with a proud smile. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my wife, Dr. Noelle Raleigh. She's joining us this week as we finalize our partnerships with the philanthropic branches." Alan's throat went dry. "Noelle." She gave a brief, regal nod to the room. "Good morning. I'm looking forward to seeing the vision this firm has, especially in how it invests in underrepresented communities." Her eyes scanned the table, then stopped on Alan. And lingered. Just for a second. Not with malice. Just recognition. He shifted in his seat, heat rising in his face. She said nothing. He prayed she wouldn't. The meeting began, but Alan didn't hear a single word for the first 20 minutes. His mind kept spinning in circles, replaying the scene on the sidewalk, the way he had mocked her, belittled her, and how calmly she had walked away. And now, she was seated beside his boss, the man who practically held Alan's career in his palm. At one point, Alan glanced across the table and found Noelle watching him, her expression unreadable, just as it had been on the street. It wasn't hostile. It was worse. She looked disappointed. Jonathan was speaking about expansion, about their new community outreach investments, and how diversity would be central to their image going forward. Alan tried to nod along, but his palms were slick with sweat. The words underrepresented communities stabbed at him with irony. How had he not known? Noelle Raleigh was a respected academic, a sociologist and public policy consultant, famous for her work in urban equity and economic inclusion. She had written op-eds in The Atlantic, had spoken at global forums, and now, apparently, was married to his boss. Alan had seen her name before, but he had never cared enough to remember it. After the meeting, people milled around in clusters. Alan tried to slide out quietly, but Jonathan called across the room. "Alan, could you come here for a second?" He stopped mid-step, turned around. "Yes, sir." Jonathan clapped him on the shoulder. "I wanted to make sure you and Noelle got introduced properly. You'll probably be working together a bit this quarter." Alan felt his lungs shrink. Noelle extended her hand smoothly, politely. "Nice to officially meet you, Mr. Mercer." He took her hand, his grip limp, shame flooding his body like cold rain. "Why you too," he said. She leaned in slightly, her voice low. "Next time," she said gently, "maybe remember that people you pass on the street aren't invisible." Then she smiled, calm, graceful, and devastating, and walked away. Alan sat alone at his desk, staring blankly at the screen. Numbers blurred. Words collapsed into static. The city view beyond his office meant nothing now, all glass and clouds and a skyline mocking his fragility. He had always considered himself composed, polished, professional, in control. But now he was spiraling. He replayed her voice again and again. "Maybe remember that people you pass on the street aren't invisible." She hadn't threatened him, hadn't exposed him, hadn't even raised her voice. But her words had stripped something from him. His mask. His certainty. He tried to rationalize it. It was a mistake. She didn't say anything to Jonathan. "It'll blow over. Just act normal." But the problem wasn't her. It was him, the version of himself he now had to confront. In private, Alan had always made assumptions. Remarks behind closed doors. Little comments at the bar with colleagues. Nothing overtly hateful, or so he convinced himself, but always with the cold edge of superiority. He thought it was harmless. Office banter. Street jokes. Code words. But that morning, for the first time in his life, it wasn't harmless. It was humiliating. He didn't even know how to look Jonathan in the eye. A knock at his door jolted him upright. Karen stepped in. "Hey, just letting you know, Noelle's coordinating a task force on community initiatives, and she's requested a few internal reviews. She asked for you directly." Alan blinked. "She asked for me?" Karen hesitated. "Yeah. Said you'd be a critical voice in the conversation." The choice of words stung. He didn't know whether to laugh or panic. "Right," he muttered. "Thanks." As Karen left, Alan leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let silence swallow him. That night, Alan joined a corporate dinner at a sleek downtown restaurant, the kind of place where the lighting was low, the wine flowed freely, and the bill quietly climbed into 4 figures. Jonathan was hosting, seated at the head of the table beside Noelle. The conversation was easy, the laughter abundant. Alan, seated 2 chairs away, sipped his drink and tried not to think. Noelle was magnetic. She spoke in measured tones, asked thoughtful questions, and laughed with genuine ease. The executives adored her. Some were surprised at how sharp she was. Others clearly underestimated her intellect until she began discussing equity investments and policy design like it was second nature. Alan caught every look, every raised brow, every man who blinked a bit too long when she spoke, trying to hide his own internal rewiring. They didn't expect someone like her to be married to someone like Jonathan, Alan thought. And now they're trying to recalibrate. It was a mirror of his own struggle, except his had curdled into guilt. Halfway through the evening, Noelle stood to excuse herself briefly. As she passed Alan, she paused. "I read your memo," she said softly, referring to a report he had submitted earlier that week. "Some interesting ideas. But next time, maybe consider how your assumptions shape your conclusions." Then she walked off. It wasn't rude. It wasn't personal. But it cut. Because she had read his words, his polished, rehearsed professional language, and saw the same bias he thought he could hide beneath corporate jargon. When she returned to the table, she smiled and slipped effortlessly back into conversation. Alan felt like the ghost of a man watching a world he no longer belonged to. By Friday, the whispers had started. It wasn't about the street incident. Noelle had told no one. But something was shifting. Alan could feel it in the way colleagues looked at him. Polite. Reserved. A little too cautious. He had always been the guy who made off-color jokes, who rolled his eyes during diversity training, who complained when women got promoted too fast. Everyone laughed, back then. Now, those same people avoided eye contact. They laughed less. Smiled tightly. As if they were waiting to see if he'd explode or evolve. He was becoming irrelevant. Noelle's task force launched that afternoon. She hosted a meeting in one of the large conference rooms. Alan was invited, along with a half-dozen mid-level and senior staff. The agenda was clear: evaluate the firm's community impact and recommend new investment strategies. Noelle began with a short presentation. She spoke about disparity, about systemic disadvantage, about the responsibility of institutions to not just reflect the world, but to shape it. Then she invited voices to contribute. Alan stayed quiet. But halfway through, she looked directly at him. "Alan, I'm especially curious about your perspective," she said. "You have a strong sense of structure and profit alignment. What's your view on how equity investments could drive growth?" All eyes turned to him. He swallowed. "Well, I think there's a lot of potential. But it has to be measured. Not just charity for optics." Noelle nodded slowly. "Of course. Measurable outcomes matter. But metrics mean nothing if they're built on flawed foundations." Alan nodded, struggling to respond. Then she added, "And sometimes the biggest obstacle to change isn't data, it's discomfort." He felt it like a hammer blow. The room went quiet. Then one by one, others began to speak. Cautious at first, then more openly. Ideas flowed. Thoughts challenged. Something genuine emerged. And Alan, for the first time in years, listened. Really listened. Not to respond. Not to defend. But to understand. And somewhere deep in the quiet corners of his shame, a tiny crack opened. Not a revelation. Not a redemption. But the start of something slower. A reckoning. It wasn't a scandal. There was no viral video. No mass resignation. No dramatic public calling out. Instead, it was death by 1,000 silences. Alan's influence began to slip. Slowly. Almost invisibly. Meetings where he once led the room now found him sidelined. Proposals he presented received tepid responses, followed by "we'll circle back," or "let's hear another approach." His ideas didn't suddenly become worse, but his voice no longer carried the same weight. Noelle didn't sabotage him. She never mentioned the street incident. In fact, she treated him with the same poised professionalism she offered everyone. But her presence magnified what he could no longer hide. The truth was clear: the culture was shifting. And he wasn't part of the future it was shifting toward. One morning, Alan walked into the main conference room for a quarterly strategy meeting. He wasn't leading it, someone from marketing was. A younger black woman with sharp wit and polished slides. She commanded the room with an ease that stung his pride. As he sat down near the back, he noticed a few eyes glance toward him. Not hostile. Not mocking. Just acknowledging. A silent awareness of his diminishing power. He tried to contribute, but his voice sounded flat even to himself. When he interrupted the presenter to correct a minor point, no one laughed like they used to. Noelle, seated beside Jonathan, leaned back, crossed her legs, and listened. She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She simply watched. And that somehow was worse than confrontation. By the end of the meeting, Alan realized something devastating. He hadn't lost his job, but he had lost his place. On Sunday, the skies turned gray, and the city was soaked in a steady drizzle. Alan didn't go to brunch. Didn't check his email. Didn't bother shaving. Instead, he wandered, coat open, hair damp, through the park near his apartment. The same park where, a week earlier, he had walked past Noelle with his chin high and his mind closed. Now, every bench, every tree seemed to whisper something back at him. He ended up at a small coffee shop on a quiet corner. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching raindrops slither down the glass. He didn't know who he was anymore. He had spent decades building an identity, the man who earned his spot, who called it like he saw it, who didn't buy into all that identity politics nonsense. But beneath all of that was fear. Fear of change. Fear of losing control. Fear of seeing himself, really seeing himself, and not liking what stared back. He thought about Noelle. How she never once demanded an apology. How she carried herself with grace, power, and restraint. She didn't humiliate him. He humiliated himself. And in that coffee shop, Alan whispered, just once and barely audibly, "I'm sorry." It wasn't enough. But it was real. For the first time, he meant it. Monday morning, the office lobby was calm. Alan stood by the espresso machine in the common area, fixing a double shot, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. It was Noelle. She wore a dark green blazer, a leather portfolio in one hand. She looked at him, not unkindly, just directly. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied, heart suddenly pounding. She moved to the machine and selected her coffee. As it whirred, the silence grew louder. Then softly, Alan said, "I don't expect anything. But I need to say it." Noelle turned slightly. "I was wrong. On the street. In general. I've been wrong for a long time." She didn't blink. And I'm sorry. Not just to you. To everyone I ever belittled without knowing I was doing it. Or maybe, even knowing. A beat passed. 2. The machine clicked. Noelle took her cup. "Do you know why I didn't say anything to Jonathan?" she asked. Alan shook his head. "Because I knew the world would do more to you than I ever could. Shame is louder when it's earned." Alan looked away. "But also," she continued, "because I believe in people changing. It doesn't erase the past. But it changes the future." She began to walk away, then paused. "I don't hate you, Alan. I pity what you used to be. But I respect who you might become." And with that, she disappeared into the corridor, leaving Alan holding a cup of bitter espresso and a weight that was finally beginning to lift. 3 months passed. Alan was still with the company, but he no longer sat near the top. Officially, his role had been transitioned. He now served in a more advisory capacity, helping newer hires understand the technical foundation of their work. A slow fade. A quiet soft landing. But Alan didn't fight it. In fact, he welcomed it. Outside the rigid framework of power and title, he had time to think. And learn. He subscribed to newsletters he once mocked. Listened to podcasts hosted by people whose voices he had previously tuned out. He started a book club with his sister, who had long grown tired of his old views but was cautiously open to this evolution. Some things were still hard. There were moments when old instincts flared, when someone corrected him and his pride surged, or when he saw promotions going to people who didn't look like him and that whisper of bitterness tried to claw back into his mind. But he didn't feed it anymore. One evening, Alan was leaving the office late. The building was mostly empty, the sky a dusky purple behind the glass. As he waited at the elevator, he heard someone behind him. It was Noelle. She was on a call, speaking French, effortlessly, like water, and typing on her phone with one hand. When she saw him, she gave a small smile and ended the call. "Late night?" he asked. "Board meeting," she said. "One of many." There was no tension between them. Just space. Honest, open space. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in together. As the metal box descended, Alan turned toward her. "I know I've said this before," he began, "but I just want to say." "You don't have to," she said, holding up a hand. "You already did." He nodded. A moment of quiet passed. The doors opened at the lobby. Noelle walked ahead. But before she exited, she turned and said, "By the way, Jonathan, read your internal memo." Alan blinked. "The one about systemic gaps in hiring practices?" She smiled. "Yeah, that one." He was impressed. "Keep going." Alan stood there, alone for a second, watching her disappear into the street, graceful, capable, unbothered. The man who had once barked at her on the sidewalk would have felt humiliated in this moment. But the man Alan had become? He felt lighter. He stepped into the night. No grand revelation. No applause. Just a subtle shift inside him, quiet, honest, and real. And in that silence, a new kind of future waited.